Hi guys, my name is Hannah Engel. I am the USG of Specialized in Crisis Committees at Wyman, Brazil, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about how Specialized in Crisis Committees are going to work at our conference. At Wyman, Brazil, we will have 7 committee sessions throughout the conference. Each of your committees will have one Yale student who is the director, as well as 2 to 3 high school or college students who will serve as assistant directors. So that will be your dais. They're there to help, so don't hesitate to reach out to them if you have any questions or concerns. We really do want to be there to make sure you have the best committee experience possible. So don't feel free to talk to us anytime. But a few pre-committee reminders. So first of all position papers must be submitted to the link on our website prior to the start of the first committee session, and that will be at 1:30 Brazilian time on August 14th. So that is to make sure that you will be eligible for awards in our committees. And then position papers that are submitted by July 29th will be given feedback by your director. So, yes, and as I said, position paper submission is required to be eligible for awards. And also a new policy, all delegates are required to turn in a half-page handwritten summary of their notes at the start of the committee session. So this is to make sure that we kind of understand where you guys were going with your research and make sure that you guys had an opportunity to really dive into what we're discussing in committee. So, policy highlights. More information on our policies is available at wymanbrazil.org. And then we have a special category on the website for policies if you want to read specifics. But highlights. First of all, our AI policy. So at YMB, we do not tolerate AI use for any in-committee activities or for writing position papers. And using AI is grounds for disqualification for awards. This is really important because we want to make sure that there's an equal playing field for everybody. And that comes with essentially making sure that you guys are putting in the work to write your own papers and to research and to be creative with anything that you do in committee as well. And so, again, your dais is happy to answer any questions you have. Don't feel like you have to turn to AI. And we will be scanning position papers and checking history on documents written in committee to make sure that they were written by delegates and not by AI. So just keep that in mind. In addition to that, for our dress code, we will be expecting that delegates wear Western business attire. You can find examples of that online, typically for delegates that might be like a suit or like a suit dress or formal pants and a shirt. And if you have any questions about that as well, feel free to reach out. And then working outside of committee. So no work outside of committee is permitted. So that means that if you are writing crisis notes, or if you are trying to develop your crisis arc, or if you want to brainstorm for a directive, all of those things should be done in committee. And then language policy. So we expect delegates to be speaking in the language of their committee at all times. This will vary by the committee. So most committees are in English. So if for as of now, if your topic guide is in English and all communications you've seen about your committee are in English, expect that your committee is in English and you should be speaking that language both in committee and out of committee with other delegates and with chairs, of course. If your committee is in Portuguese, then of course that will be the language in which you are able to conduct any writing, debate, etc. But it should be clear from your topic guides which language your committee will be in. And then, of course, there are more policies. Feel free to look on our website. Now, a few tips and reminders from our secretariat. The first is that the foundation of any good committee performance is good research. And so I would say that the best way to get started on that is to go to your topic guide, of course, and then look through everything that your director has written because we put a lot of time into making them. And then after that, go to any resources that they provided, and then look at those websites as well. But then after that, I would really recommend going and finding some academic publications or reputable news sites, government websites, anything that can help you get like a full, well-rounded idea of what's going on in committee. And in addition to like the topics you're discussing, specifically about your characters, because as specialized in crisis delegates, you will be taking responsibility for really understanding who you are representing as a person or an organization, whatever representation you are expected to have in committee. So really try to understand and embody that. Best way to do that is through research. So, yeah, take ample time to search through reliable sources and organize your thoughts in your position paper. That's another reason why writing a position paper is so helpful. And it's good not to rush through it because it really gives you a solid foundation, so that when you come in committee, you're very prepared and your thoughts are already kind of in order. Now, next is to be energetic. My recommendation for this is to not read off of a script when you're giving speeches, because really we want to see that you guys are like really excited about what you're talking about, that you're confident, that you want to convince people. The best way to convince people is to seem like you're sure of what you're saying, right? So speeches and positions will always come across better when you have energy and enthusiasm. So anything that you can do, whether that's hand motions, whether that is making direct eye contact with people, it makes you seem much more confident, and it really attracts a lot of attention to the topic that you are bringing attention to. Finally, is listening to what others have to say. So, importantly, Model UN is not just about, how can I be the most convincing delegate? How can I be the best leader? It is also about being a good teammate. And I think that that can sometimes be difficult to balance. So, our recommendation for that for delegates is to really like understand what other delegates are saying and give time and energy to working with those ideas. So, for example, if a lot of people are trying to work on a directive, it's great to have your ideas and to really advocate for them and help other people understand them. In addition to that, let other people share their ideas. Give them the time and respect to really flesh out what they mean. And look for ways where you might have common ground and you can combine whatever ideas you guys are working on in a directive. So yeah, really try to understand the positions of others, and it can even help you further your own goals in committee. Now, for positions, unlike in GAs and ECOSOCs, specialized and crisis committees are usually made up of people and they're like real, or they could be fictional, they could be historical, instead of representing like a country, for example. So, you may be the king of a nation rather than the delegate representing Somalia. You know what I mean? So, this is something that you will find out, or you may have already found out, when this video is released. And in your topic guide, you will have a list of all the positions, and you can find out more about who specifically you are representing, as well as who else you can expect to be in your committee. Now, how do positions work in specialized and crisis committees? As I mentioned, instead of representing countries, delegates in specialized and crisis committees will typically represent individual characters. So these characters could be real, they could be fictional, but you will all receive biographical information on who you're representing prior to the conference. I would recommend, in addition to that biographical information that you receive, do some separate research on the character. If they're real, it should be pretty easy. You can go on, any website that has information on them that seems reputable. If they're fictional, don't worry. It's you also have the ability to do research because usually fictional characters will be based on like an archetype that existed in either the real world or in this fictional universe. So if you are representing like a made up prince. Look up the history of the region that they're representing. Look up what royalty in that period would do. And then you can kind of get an idea of, maybe a person isn't real, but if they were, what would they be like? What would their goals be, etc. So because you're representing individuals, and this is very important for writing position papers and in committee as well, you're going to be using personal pronouns. So instead of saying the delegate of blank, you'll say I, which, kind of makes the process simpler. And it also is really fun because you're like fully embodying these positions that you are advocating for. You can really get so much more energetic. You can say, I believe this. And it's like you're, just in the real world, right? And so I would say try to approach it more as it's almost like acting, right? Like you are that person. And then in addition to that, the role the delegate is assigned determines your personal powers. So think of this kind of in relation to what specific benefits you bring to the committee, because every person that was involved or included in the position list by your director is there for a reason. So you might be wondering, like, why am I an architect in this committee about war? There's a reason that there's an architect, right? Like your director has a vision. There's probably hinted at in your little biographical information. Take advantage of that and be creative. So, maybe the architect is there because you need to be able to build like fortresses or like some kind of military technology. So think about how can I use my specific skills that this character I'm assigned would realistically have, And then how can I bring that into committee to make people want to work with me? So that could be for directives, like for example, I will use my skills as an architect to do this, this, and this, which other people would probably support, right? Or it could be for your individual crisis arc. So you'll hear from your directors if you're going to have individual crisis arcs in committee. But if your committee is one where you will have crisis arcs, think about, what are my individual motivations? What are my individual skills as an architect? Like, what could I possibly want out of this situation? For example, maybe at the end of the day, you want to have your own huge architecture business and you want to be a millionaire, right? So finding ways of like achieving that through the personal powers and skills that you have is really helpful. Now, parliamentary procedure. This is just a kind of brief overview of the differences. So, all committees in One Man Brazil will follow UNA USA procedure, which means that debate is going to alternate between moderated and unmoderated caucuses for the most part. Moderated caucuses are the formal debate where, it might be like a 6 minute, 30-second debate on blank topic, right? Unmoderated caucus is much more casual, might be like a 10-minute unmoderated caucus, and everyone just gets up and they just talk to each other. You might be writing directives, but it's much more casual. And as a result of the constant changes that you're going to be experiencing in specialized and crisis committees, unlike in, a GA or an ECOSOC, the transition between moderated and unmoderated caucuses and writing directives is going to be much quicker. So, in a GA, for example, you might spend like two committee sessions really diving into the topics, right? So like, you could have some moderated, some unmoderated caucuses, but you're not really deep into the writing process yet. For crisis and specialized committees, every committee session you are churning out directives, right? So you'll have like a moderated caucus, you'll have maybe another one, maybe you'll have an unmoderated, and then like the directives, like one round is already done. You could be presenting and voting by the end of the first committee session. So just keep that in mind. The speed is going to be much different than GAs and EcoSocs if that's what you're used to. Now, the beginning of committee in GAs and EcoSocs, again, to compare. So, of course, we start with opening debate. Next is the speakers list. So, a delegate will motion to open the speakers list, and then you can raise your placard to be added. Next, you're going to set the agenda, which essentially just means deciding whether you're going to start with topic one or with topic two. And then finally, points or motions. So delegates will propose points or motions, whether that be like moderated or unmoderated caucuses, or maybe like a point of inquiry, things like that, to proceed with debate. Now, the important difference, instead of using a speakers list in crisis and specialized, we will be using round robins. Now, you can choose to use a speakers list if you would prefer, but the benefit of a round robin is that every single person in the room gets to speak. Whereas with a speakers list, a select few are going to have the chance to speak. And the reason that round robins are really helpful in a specialized or crisis committee is because typically they're going to be around like 20 delegates in each committee. All specialized and crisis committees will have like less than 30 delegates. And so understanding each individual delegate and their position is super important. There's just so many fewer people, right? And so you need to know where everyone stands. And so having round robin means that each person will go around in a circle. They'll have maybe like 30 seconds or a minute. And you're kind of like rehashing whatever you wrote in your position paper. So you could say, this topic is really important to me. I think we should start with this one. It is critical to blank, 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 right? Um, and so it's a really helpful tool in specialized and crisis committees. The rest of like these different steps are essentially the same. You're opening debate, you're setting the agenda, and then points or motions. Now, I kind of already talked about round robins, gave you guys a bit of a spoiler, but just to kind of summarize, each delegate is granted the opportunity to speak. Now, what information is required to motion for a round robin? First, just a little quiz. What information do you guys think is required to call for a moderated caucus? So, for a moderated caucus, you need to have the total speaking time. That could be like 6 minutes, for example. You need to have the individual speaking time, maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute. And then finally, you need to have the topic. And so, what that would look like in a full sentence would be, the delegate of, or in a specialized crisis committee, I motion for a 6 minute moderated caucus with a 30-second individual speaking time on the topic of climate change. Now, similarly, for a round robin, because it is a type of moderated caucus, you are going to have that same information included. There's only a slight difference. So, first, you want to have individual speaking time. So that means, each person in the circle that is speaking is going to speak for maybe 30 seconds or a minute. You want to have the topic, right? So, for example, climate change. You want to know what you're going to be discussing. And then finally, rather than doing the total speaking time, because everyone's going to speak, you're going to say the first or last speaker. So, for example, I might say motion for a 30-second round robin on climate change, and I would like to speak first. In that case, I'll be speaking first. The circle will go clockwise or counterclockwise, kind of at the discretion of the director. And then it will just proceed until every delegate has spoken. And if there's, like, for example, when people don't fill up all their time, in a normal moderated caucus, you might yield your time to the chair, to another delegate. In round robins, you don't really need to yield unless you want to yield to another delegate, but there is no set speaking time total. So even if you get through the whole circle and a bunch of people like didn't finish their time, you don't need to like continue on in a circle until a certain amount of time has been reached, right? So it's kind of simple that way. You just go in a circle till everyone's done. And so that's an example of how you would call for a round robin. So if you like in specialized and crisis committees, because it is a little bit different from GAs and ECOSOCs, delegates might not be aware that round robins are commonly used. So, your director might, at the beginning of committee, say that the dais looks favorably upon a motion for a round robin. This just means kind of like a recommendation for you guys. Like, we think it would be great if you called for this, and you might not know to do it. So whenever the chair smiles favorably upon something, it's basically just like kind of us giving you guys a push in the right direction if we aren't sure if you would know to do that yet. You don't have to abide by that. It's not a rule, but it's definitely like a strong recommendation. And another thing about round robins is that they cannot be interrupted for a point or motion. So, what you might be used to with the speakers list is a certain number of delegates go, and then in between speeches, people can call for a different point or motion, right? So, the chair might have three people speak, and then say, "Are there any other points or motions on the floor?" At that point, someone might raise their placard and say, "Motion for a moderated caucus, unmoderated caucus, whatever it may be." For the speakers, for round robins, every single person in the circle has to go before anyone can call for another motion. So that's really important to keep in mind. And of course, if you have a point of like personal privilege, if you have to go to the bathroom, go ahead. But for things that would disrupt the flow of committee, we wait until the end of the round robin. Now, after setting the agenda, specialized and crisis committees proceed with debate by alternating between points or motions, just like in a GA or an ECOSOC committee. Now, motions. Types of motions. Motions typically require a simple majority to pass. So that just means 50% of the room plus one. So like in a 20-person committee, you need 11 people to pass a motion. So the most common types of motions are motions for moderated and unmoderated caucuses, though there are others that are used. So in order from most to least disruptive, the most would be to enter voting procedure. That could be like on a directive, for example. The next would be motion to introduce directives. And then next would be motion for an extension of the current moderated or unmoderated caucus. So you can usually extend by 50% of the time of the original caucus. So if you had a 20-minute unmoderated caucus, you could extend by 10 minutes. After that, the motion for an unmoderated caucus is most disruptive, and then finally, a motion for a moderated caucus. And in addition to that, the speaking time allotted during moderated caucuses will determine which is most disruptive. So, types of moderated caucuses, as I mentioned earlier, a round robin is a type of moderated caucus. And so you don't really have to know much about that. Essentially, it just means that there's similarities in the ways in which they're called for, as we mentioned earlier. So having the topic mentioned, having the individual speaking time, because these are both moderated caucuses. Now, speaking time during moderated caucuses. So one difference between GAs and ECOSOCs and crisis and specialized committees is kind of in the amount of time that people are given to speak. And this isn't like a really strict rule. It's more of like what's like customary in these committees, because in GAs and ECOSOCs there are many more delegates and people usually don't get the chance to speak as often. You want the usually the individual speaking time to be longer. So maybe delegates speak for a minute and a half, because you might not be called on for a few more rounds, right? But in a specialized or crisis committee, you're called on a lot. You're called on really often because there's only like 20 delegates in committee. And what you often see if you're given a minute or a minute and a half speaking time for each delegate is that, you might not be able to actually fill all that time because you're just speaking so often in committee. And so what you'll usually see is that um, total speaking times, of course, will be shorter because there are fewer people. But in addition to that, individual speaking time will usually be shorter as well. So it's very common to see a 30-second individual speaking time, a 45-second speaking time. A minute is usually like the max you'll ever see. And if like consistently people aren't filling a minute time, then consider calling for a 45-second or a 30-second in the future. Um, and then for points, first, try to think of a few kinds of points in your head. Like if there was anything coming up in committee that wasn't a motion, how would you call for it? And then I'll switch to the next slide. So, types of points. These cover a lot of different kind of topics in committee. They're usually not used to like progress debate. Typically, you can think of a point like maybe it's a clarification, maybe it's a personal issue that you're having, um, and that's essentially how they're used. So they're not voted on because it's just an individual kind of like suggestion, for example. Um, and they're not used very often, but it is good to understand them in case you need to use it. So first, you have a point of inquiry. So that's a question on parliamentary procedure. So if you're genuinely kind of confused on what's going on, maybe about like how voting procedure worked or how the order of a round robin is going to go, you can raise your placard, point of inquiry, and then just say the question. Another option for that is to just send a note to the dais or talk to a director or an assistant director during like an unmoderated caucus or a break. But if it is something that you feel like is like really urgent that you understand, go ahead and raise a point of inquiry. Now, point of order is similar because it is also about procedure, but it's more that you're concerned about how procedure is being conducted. So maybe you think that the motions were not voted from most to least disruptive. Like maybe they voted on a moderated caucus before an unmoderated caucus. You can raise your placard and say point of order, and then once the chair calls on you, obviously, you can express what your concern is. Now, this importantly is up to the discretion of the chair. So maybe you have a concern about how something's being conducted, but the chair thinks that the committee would progress best if they continued in the direction that they're going. Then at that point, there's nothing wrong with raising that point, but we just progress in the direction that the chair suggests. Now, point of personal privilege is just a personal request, like I mentioned earlier. Maybe you need to go to the bathroom, maybe you need to get water, or just step outside and like get a breather. That is totally fine. Usually, we will have like a sign out sheet for the bathroom, and your chair will talk about this when you get to committee. So, if you have any individual questions for your specific committee, you can talk to them when you arrive. But points of personal privilege can kind of like interrupt committee for no reason. Like if someone's giving a speech, like we don't need to know that you're going to the bathroom as long as you sign out on the sheet, right? Um, so talk to your chair about that, but that'll usually be how we conduct, bathroom breaks or water. And then point of information is just a clarifying question about the content of a speech. So if a delegate says something that you're just like genuinely confused a little bit, like what their point is or like about a statistic they used, you can raise a point of information and ask them. This again is not super common because usually it's better for the flow of debate if you send them an individual note asking, or if you talk to them during an unmoderated caucus. If it's super urgent, of course, a point of information is appropriate. But again, it is sort of up to the discretion of the chair whether we accept points of information, points of order, anything that disrupts the flow of debate. Now, backroom. This is like one of the most exciting parts of specialized in crisis committees. First, try to brainstorm what you think backroom could be. If we're already done specialized in crisis committees, you're probably familiar. But I'll give you a second to just think. So, as you can kind of see, there's a little spoiler at the bottom. But in specialist and crisis committees, several members of the dais, so that could be your director and your assistant directors, are tasked with managing the back room. And responsibilities include responding to crisis notes from delegates and developing crisis updates for committee. Now, if you're wondering what is a crisis note, what's a crisis update, you'll hear in the next slides. So crisis updates to start. Crisis updates are unexpected announcements that are presented to delegates usually 2 to 3 times per committee session, usually in the form of a dramatic performance. And really, the purpose of them is to change the course of committee. And so we're challenging you guys to think of solutions really on the spot, on topics or scenarios that you aren't necessarily prepared for. But it really is challenging you guys to be strong leaders, strong teammates, and adaptable. And so some crisis updates will even include a time limit. So, for example, you might have a 30-minute timed crisis during which we tell you guys about like a scenario where like you need to pass a directive on this within 30 minutes. You need to debate, go through unmoderated caucus, develop a directive, and pass it within that allotted time. So it can be kind of challenging, but it's super fun. And so prior to the conference, each delegate should establish a crisis arc, which will guide kind of your goals through committee. And a crisis arc would also include how you utilize the powers of your position, any updates that you want to spark, and if applicable, possible crisis notes. So for your crisis arc, again, like I mentioned earlier, whoever you're assigned to be in committee, you need to like really figure out how can I embody them both in front room when I'm debating, but also in back room. How can I use crisis notes, which I'll discuss in a second, to further my own individual goals? So when a crisis update comes, for example, when they present something unexpected to committee, you need to think as your character, how would I respond to this, both in debate and in the note that I'm going to write and send, that benefits me the most, essentially. Now, crisis notes. Um, a slight note on this. This says it's only applicable to crisis committees, but you'll be hearing from your chair whether or not your committee will have crisis notes. So stay tuned on that. Now, a crisis note are letters written by delegates and sent privately to backroom. And the purpose is to allow you guys to secretly request resources, services, or information from any connections that you could reasonably have as your character. So they can be written to anybody, real or fictional, but it can't be written to somebody in the committee. So there's a difference between like a note that you pass to another delegate and a note that you pass to backroom. If you pass it to backroom, you need to write to somebody who isn't present. That could be your brother, an old friend, a colleague. And then when you write to that person, you should make it really clear to us like why you're writing to them and how you're connected to them. So for example, you could write like, Dear Steve, my brother, it's been so long since I've seen you, you know? So we know that it's your brother. It's not just some random guy named Steve, right? And then in addition to that, you might want to be like, oh, my brother Steve, um, President of the United States. So we know like why you would write to your brother Steve, right? So you're kind of giving a little bit of context. And then when writing a good crisis note, you should include details on, like I said, your connection to the person. And then in addition to that, when you're writing that note, it's usually to request something from them, right? So we want to know, why are you requesting this thing? Maybe you are asking for $1 million. Why do you need $1 million? What are you going to use it for? Why should I, Steve, give you $1 million, right? And then in addition to that, you might want to clarify, like, if you give me $1 million, I don't know, pet your dog, right? I'll do something for you. So make sure that you say all of those details in the letter so that we understand who you're writing to, why you're writing to them, why they're relevant, what their role is, what you want from them, and then what you'll do in return. So, like we say, your crisis note should paint a picture. Bland crisis notes don't get approved. In addition to that, crisis notes that aren't detailed don't get approved. So if you just write like a 3 sentence little letter where you ask for some huge request and don't tell us how that would even be accomplished, it's really hard for us to approve that and then let it happen because, it can change a lot in committee. But if we don't know that it's really well thought out, then we aren't sure that it's a good idea for the progress of debate, right? So this is an example of a good crisis note. And I'm going to show you. these here are highlighted in blue, like what the important parts are. So I want you guys to think for a second, like why are each of these parts important? I'll give you a minute, maybe pause the video, and then I'll flip to the next slide and I'll show you what each of those things is revealing. Okay, so let's start. First, we say, Dear Harry. So we have a name for the person. That's an important detail. We want to have a name for them so that when Backroom is responding, we know, who to sign from, right? Next, just a little greeting. I hope you're doing well. Now, blue section, my dear friend. This is good because it establishes the connection, right? We want to know why you would write to Harry because he's your friend. Okay. Now, I hope you're enjoying your recent promotion as the Minister of Magic. Harry Potter fans, you'll get this, right? But good, Minister of Magic. That establishes the role that Harry has. So, yes, you're writing to him because he's your friend, but why can your friend help you? Because of his job. Okay. Now, I've missed you since our last trip to the Leaky Cauldron. We must meet up again soon. That's just a little bit of filler, right? So I'll just skip past the next couple sentences. Now, you see, it's been my dream ever since my brother Fred was killed to win the Wizarding Shop of the Year award in his honor. This tells us why you're writing to Harry. So, yes, he's the Minister of Magic, but why do you need help from the Minister of Magic? Because of this ultimate motive that you want to win this award. Got it. A little bit of filler after that. And now, however, the owner of the shop next door, Gregory Goyle, has been employing house elves to ransack my store at night. Now, this is telling you the problem that needs to be solved. So you're writing to your friend, who's the Minister of Magic, because you want to accomplish this goal. You want to win an award, but you can't win it because somebody is actively working against you. That gives us all the context that we need. Okay, now let's get into what we're requesting. So, as a Minister of Magic and my lifelong friend, it would mean so much to me if you would send 10 Aurors in to secretly investigate Goyle and put an end to this nonsense. This tells you very explicitly what you are requesting. So, you're not just saying, please send some soldiers in. Send them where? Send how many? We need to know that information. So, you're going to send 10 Aurors and exactly what they're going to do. They're going to investigate Goyle. Got it. Now, if you come to the store, which is at 93 Diagon Alley, tomorrow night around 11 p.m., you will catch them in the act. This is also important because you're telling them exactly where to go, not just come meet me somewhere. No, come meet me at 93 Diagon Alley, right? And not just at some time, specifically at 11 p.m., because you're going to catch them doing what I want you to investigate, right? So if they came at 2 p.m., it wouldn't help. So that's why if you give details, you're more likely to be successful in the crisis note. Moving forward, you should advocate for 6 months of surveillance at the very least, although jail time would be more fitting. Again, this is a continuation of the request that you're making. So you want them to send 10 Aurors, you want them to investigate Goyle, and you want them to advocate for prison time. That's important because if you just investigate, what then, right? Now, finally, in return, I'll put in a good word with my sister Ginny so she stops bothering you about Christmas shopping with the kids. This is making the request kind of more enticing to the person you're writing to. Because again, in the real world, if you're asking for something big, if you want someone to pull strings for you, and you're just like, thank you, and that's all, they might be less enthusiastic to do it. But if you say, in return, I'll make your life a little bit easier, they're more likely to help, right? So think of a way that you can help them in addition to them helping you. Finally, you sign off, of course, with your name. That's very important. You should always write your delegate's name in the letter and then on the outside when you fold it up so that we know who to give it back to when we're giving back notes in committee. And then finally, the most important thing that you need to include in your crisis note is a TLDR. That stands for too long, didn't read, but you don't actually have to write that out. TLDR. If you forget the acronym, just write summary. So essentially, the TLDR, like I said, is a summary of the information that you included in your crisis note. So you want to include the main details. You want to include who you're writing to, what you're requesting, when, so the logistics, right? Like when you want this done, etc. Where, like we said, like an address, and then why you want this done, maybe how you can help. So those 5 W's, really important to consider. Include in your crisis note and then include in the summary at the very bottom. Now, we can talk a little bit about directives, which are the essentially written work that you develop in committee and specialized in crisis. So, directives, unlike resolutions or draft, like working papers, are not as long, they're not as detailed. So, in a G and EcoSoc, you are writing draft resolutions, etc., for committee sessions at a time, right? Like these are taking multiple days. But the difference in specialized in crisis committees is that you're really only going to work on each of these for a very short period of time. Like at most, like half a committee session is spent on a directive. And that's kind of like would be a long time. So, as a result of that, instead of having, 3, 4 pages back and front written with all the details, you're only going to have about half a page to a page and a half. And a page and a half would be like the absolute maximum. Like your chair might even ask you to shorten it, right? In addition to that, rather than having it written on a computer, these are all going to be handwritten, and that's because it's moving so quickly. Like we don't need you guys to all be collaborating on one Google document, for example. You can just have like a note page out. It doesn't have to be super formal. It doesn't have. You can cross things out. You can add in post-it notes. Like it does not have to look perfect. As long as it's done, right? Because again, it's a crisis. So you don't have to worry about it being just beautifully written. And then in addition to that, rather than moving through multiple rounds of drafting, presenting, voting, directives only move through each of these phases once. So you might have an unmoderated caucus. You write the entire directive during that one unmoderated caucus, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, done. After that, you bring it to the dais. So you present it and then someone calls to present the directives. You read it. You might take amendments. The chair might not allow you to because, again, these are not as complex, they're not as long. And typically, amendments in specialized and crisis committees can kind of mess with the flow of debate. So you might just skip amendments altogether. And then after that, you'll usually have like a 2 for 2 against or a Q&A, which are essentially ways of helping people get to know a little bit more about the directive. And then finally, you vote. So you're not going to, present it, go back to drafting, present it, get amendments. This only happens one time. So, what makes a good directive? Again, directives are shorter, like we mentioned. So, as a result of that, it is really helpful to not think of them as addressing the entire topic. Each directive is really like focused on a small detail. So, if the topic one of your committee is climate change, a directive should not solve climate change because it's really short. Like, you can't solve climate change in half a page. A directive should really tackle maybe like carbon emissions in one industry, for example. So something really niche, really small that you can flesh out in a page, but does significantly help whatever you're discussing. Now, in addition to that, a lot of directives will come as like a response to a crisis update. So maybe the backroom comes in and tells you something that completely alters the course of committee. Then everyone is like debating, you have moderated caucus, and then in your unmoderated caucus, the directive that you're writing is going to respond to that change that they just told you about. So usually you're not going to be like struggling like what could I write a directive about? It'll be really clear based on what's happening in committee like what you should be tackling. In addition to that, directives do not include preambulatory clauses. They're made up entirely of operative clauses. So we'll show an example, but it essentially just means like it's a little bit less formal. It's a little bit more concise. And then when directives are passed, they become true in the world of committee and they can have a significant impact. So think of it as, it passes, the world is immediately like transformed. So if you said in a directive that all dogs will become blue and then it passes, like dogs are blue. You don't need to like worry about how the directive is going to work. Like if it was well thought out and everyone passed it, it's done, right? And so because of that, it can have a really like significant impact on the progression of committee because as soon as the directive is passed, we hand that off to backroom. We're like, okay, look at this, like think about it. You might see a mention of it in your next crisis update to committee. So it can be really influential as you're still working in committee. In addition to that, good directives may resolve the immediate conflict that you have. But if a directive isn't written very well, then it can actually like make committee more difficult, if that makes sense. So, for example, if you had a crisis update where you're in a war, for example, and the crisis update says that part of your defenses were just taken out, right? So you're kind of not in a good place militarily. You want to obviously write a crisis update or a directive to respond to that. But if your directive that you use to respond is really weak and you're not telling us where you're going to move your soldiers, how many you want to move, what they're going to do when they get there, how you're going to rebuild, if you're kind of just like, we're going to move soldiers and make people safer, then our next crisis update might come in where we're like, unfortunately, you lost the war, right? Because there were no details and we don't know what you're going to do. And, this is not really going to help the war effort. So think about that when you're writing directives. A good directive can really be impactful, but so can a bad one. So just think about that. Work really hard during the writing process to make it as detailed as possible. So here's an example of a good directive. You'll notice there are no preambulatory clauses. And so when you start off a sentence, you'll just put like one and then establishes or implements, any word like that. And you don't have to say like understanding that this conflict is blah, 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 right? You just start off with the actual action that you're taking. This is based on Love Island. I don't know if any of you guys were watching that. So you might enjoy this. I don't know if it's accurate. Um, but anyway, so you write point one, establishes whatever it may be. And then after that, you can do subpoints. So you could do point A, and then you can do bullet points. But you'll notice that after the initial establishes or implements, you don't have to use those words anymore. So you can just say, point one establishes a bombshell orientation process to acclimate new Love Islanders to the villa. And then subpoint A, immediately upon arrival, each newcomer will receive a 15-minute presentation, blah, 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 blah. So you're just saying exactly what is going to happen. Because, like we said, when a directive is passed, it just becomes true. And then for the directive, obviously you have to name it. And then you'll have sponsors and signatories. Typically, there will be a required maximum of sponsors and minimum of signatories. So for sponsors, the maximum might be, for example, three, because each of our committees in Specialized in Crisis is around 20 delegates. And then signatories, you'll usually have a minimum of like three or four, because we want to make sure that you guys showed your directive to enough people already that people kind of know what's going on and are interested in it, right? So, drafting, debating, and voting on directives, we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but you're not going through each of these phases a lot of times. Like, you're not drafting, amending, voting over and over. So, first, there's crisis update, where you might get the idea of what you're going to write about. Then you have a moderated caucus, usually like two or three, so you kind of like can get to the root of what you guys want to do about an issue. After that, you have an unmoderated caucus, almost always less than 30 minutes. 30 minutes would be like if you have a timed crisis, but usually unmoderated caucus will be like less than 20. Anyway, after that, you finish your directive and then you present it to the committee and you obviously debate and vote on it. So, a few similarities and differences in presentation. Similarly to GAs and ECOSOCs, the chair has the discretion to determine how the directive will be presented. So the chair can choose to read the directive themselves, or they can invite sponsors to read it to the entire committee. And then in addition to that, delegates can choose to propose a Q&A or 2 for, 2 against to address any concerns that the committee might have. Now, importantly, like we mentioned earlier, specialized in crisis committees rarely allow for amendments to directives. And that's just because it kind of messes with the flow of debate, and directives are meant to be really efficient, concise, and just get the problem solved. So if you're, objecting to the use of and you want it to be or, like it doesn't change that much, and it takes some time for this like crisis, right? So we kind of just move forward most of the time. Now, presentation and voting. Due to the fast-paced nature of committee, there is typically no Q&A period. Instead, when motioning to present a directive, the delegate should only include time for presentation. So, like we mentioned earlier, like you might choose to have a Q&A or a 2 for, 2 against, but it's not necessarily like a requirement. And then in addition to that, you're not going to have like you might in a GA and EcoSoc like a 5-minute Q&A. It'll be like 2 minutes at most. So anyway, so to make that motion, you could say motion to present directive 1.1 with a presentation time of 5 minutes. And that, or for example, you could say motion to move to enter voting procedure after this directive is presented, when 2 for, 2 against speeches with 1 minute per speaker. So that is the basics of specialized in crisis committees for Wyman, Brazil. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions at all, you can email dg.committees@wymanb.org. You can also reach out to your chairs if you have any questions about committee-specific information, or to me if you have any specialized in crisis questions that I can answer. But I hope you guys learned a little bit from this, and good luck in committee.